Coming up on Extraordinary Faith, what's old is new again in the world of sacred art, architecture, liturgy, and music. In this second of 2 episodes from the Motor City, we'll continue our drive through the historic churches of Detroit, starting off with Old St. Mary's, a downtown church that has offered Latin liturgy for decades. We'll tour the ornate and lovingly maintained St. Hyacinth Church in Poletown. We'll learn about priestly vestments while visiting Hamtramck's St. Florian Church. And we'll meet a group of volunteers who have taken on the incredible challenge of rescuing and restoring one of Detroit's largest and oldest Polish churches, St. Albertus. Jump in the car with us on Extraordinary Faith. Hello, I'm Alex Began. Welcome to Extraordinary Faith, a program that travels across the globe to bring you inspiring stories about traditional Catholic architecture, liturgy, music, and culture. In this episode, we're continuing to come to you from my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. The city grew rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as workers arrived to serve the automobile industry. As a result, numerous ornate churches were built to serve these residents. Let's take a look inside some of them. Many major cities have 1 or 2 main downtown historic tourist churches. In Detroit, that church is Old St. Mary's in the Greektown Entertainment District. Bob Barnhart is the parish music director. Bob, how would you characterize Old St. Mary's parish mission?
St. Mary's is actually a parish church, and so all of our missionary activities happen in our parish. In addition to that, since we find ourselves in the downtown area, in a business district, we also provide services, daily masses and confessions and devotions for people who live and work downtown. As well, since we're close to all the entertainment facilities here in downtown Detroit, we also provide the availability of Sunday masses for people who are visiting town.
And those Sunday masses are not your typical ordinary form masses.
That's correct. We have a Saturday evening mass, which is very often attended by lots of tourists. However, on Sunday we have a 10 o'clock mass that's in Latin, the Novus Ordo. It's a choral service. And as far as we know, St. Mary's has never had a mass that's not been in Latin.
What about daily mass?
We have a mass at noontime every day. It's preceded with confession, and 3 days of the week it's preceded with novenas. The unusual thing about St. Mary's is that it has always been the tradition here to receive communion kneeling at the rail.
The church itself has some interesting artwork. Can you show us around?
Sure. We're standing in the new church. This was built in 1875. The parish was founded in the 1830s, and the original church eventually became too small. St. Mary's now can easily handle 800 people.
Bob, I understand there's some special history behind the high altar.
The high altar is the only piece left in the church that's from the original church building of the early 1800s. It was carved by a Redemptorist priest who was in residence here at St. Mary's. There's an unusual feature about the location of the cross over the tabernacle. That is to say, when Mass is not being celebrated, there's a beautiful representation of Jesus the Lamb that turns to leave a niche for the monstrance during benediction. And finally, you turn again, and that reveals the cross for the celebration of the Mass. Another interesting thing about the altar is just above the cross, those 3 little domes can be removed. So on special holidays, if we want to put plants up there, they can come down. You'll see there are panels on either side of the statue of those Blessed Virgin. They're actually hinged so that when we want to change the crown, we can just open the panel and reach over. In 1989, we suffered a fire on Good Friday night this altar was destroyed completely. A local woodworker, Bill Williamson, recreated this beautiful altar from photographs that parishioners had taken. The Sacred Heart of Jesus at the top is the most spectacular piece of carving on this altar. In the south transept, we have a small shrine to Our Lady of Sorrows, flanked by a fairly substantial collection of relics. Old St. Mary's Church was originally dedicated to our patron saint Mary under the title of the Immaculate Conception. This painting on the ceiling above the crossing of the nave was restored after the fire in '89. In the early 20th century, St. Mary's was referred to as the Church of the Grottos. This is a baptismal grotto that was restored about 15 years ago. This is the entrance to our Lourdes grotto.
We're delighted to report that not long after we shot this interview, Old St. Mary's began to offer the traditional Latin Mass on First Fridays. It's a perfect match for this glorious sacred space. In this installment of our series explaining the traditional Latin Mass, we're joined by Father Lee Acervo, pastor of St. Edward-on-the-Lake Parish in Lakeport, Michigan. We're in the beautiful surroundings of St. Florian Church in Hamtramck, Michigan. Father Acervo, in our last segment, we left off when people were just arriving at the church for a Sunday Mass. One of the things that people will find when they arrive at a Mass is the rosary is being prayed before Mass. Why is that?
I think it's important to remember that everything that happens before the Mass is geared towards preparing the soul and the heart and the mind for what is about to happen, for the reception of Holy Communion and the celebration of the sacrifice of the Mass. And so the Rosary serves that as one of its purposes, to prepare the heart and the mind and the soul for what is about to happen. And so people typically like to pray the Rosary as a means to prepare themselves. There is also, of course, the matter of indulgences that are received in praying the Rosary in public, and also asking for the intercession of the Blessed Mother as one prepares to come to Mass.
It's often the case that confessions are available before Mass.
That's true. Oftentimes there's at least one priest who is hearing confessions before Mass. And again, if we're thinking in terms of preparation, one wants to make sure that they are properly prepared spiritually for the reception of Holy Communion and for participating at the Holy Mass. And so it's always a good idea for one to examine themselves and to make sure that there aren't any obstacles in the way of sin that might prevent them from receiving Holy Communion or receiving the graces of Holy Mass. And so oftentimes a priest will make himself available for anyone who would like to go to confession before Mass. It's always beneficial for us to receive Holy Communion in the state of grace.
For purposes of this series, we're assuming that we're talking about a Sunday High Mass here. Being Sunday, the first thing that people tend to see is the asparagus, or sprinkling rite. Please explain what that is.
The asparagus, or during Paschal time, the Vidi Aquam, is the sprinkling rite that happens at the beginning. We are sprinkled with holy water, or the people are sprinkled with holy water, usually for two purposes. Number one, to remind us of our baptismal promises, but also during the asparagus, we ask the Lord to cleanse us of our sins, cleanse us of our iniquities, again, so that we are properly prepared for the reception of Holy Communion and the celebration of Mass.
After that, the priest returns to the altar, and what happens next?
After prayers which conclude the asparagus, the priest will remove the cope, which is the outer vestment for the asparagus, and then he will change into the chasuble, which is the outer vestment for the offering of the Holy Mass. And then the priest, accompanied by the servers, will return to the foot of the altar, and there he will begin praying. Now the prayers at the foot of the altar are priest preparatory prayers. And during these prayers, again, the priest is asking God to prepare his soul, prepare him for the sacrifice of the Mass. And there are various aspects to those preparatory prayers, most notably the double Confiteor, in which the priest admits his sinfulness and asks the Lord, through the intercession of the Blessed Mother and all of the saints, to pray for him, to intercede for him, that he might be worthy to offer the sacrifices of the Mass.
After the prayers at the foot of the altar, then the priest ascends the altar.
Right. And in doing so, he says two prayers. One is called the Offerta Nobis. During that prayer, he is ascending up to the altar into the Holy of Holies. And so he is asking the Lord to make him worthy to offer the sacrifice of the Mass. Then he kisses the altar, venerating the relics that are in the altar of the saints, asking the Lord that for the intercession of the saints as he prepares to offer the Mass.
And now he moves on to the first of the propers in the Mass.
That's right. After he prays those two prayers, ascending into the altar, the next thing that would follow, especially if it were a Sunday High Mass, would be the first incensation. And much like in the ordinary form, when we incense the altar, it's a means of preparing the altar for the sacrifice that is about to take place on the altar. And then afterwards, the first prayer that he would say is the introit. And basically, the introit is a psalm and an accompanying antiphon that serves as an introduction to the particular Mass that is being celebrated. After the introit, he would pray with the servers, the Kyrie, the Lord have mercy, and following that, he would recite the Gloria.
We appreciate your insights, Father Acervo. We'll continue this series on the Mass in a future episode. We're here with Mike Smigelski in one of Detroit's most stunningly well-maintained churches, St. Hyacinth, located on the city's Near East Side. Mike, first of all, who was St. Hyacinth?
St. Hyacinth was born in the 12th century in Poland. He comes from a family of nobility. He became a priest and at one point met St. Dominic. He was so interested in the Dominican life and witnessing the miracle of St. Dominic that he became a Dominican himself. He traveled throughout Poland, Lithuania, and Kiev, including Northern Europe, to bring the gospel to those peoples. St. Hyacinth died and was canonized in the year 1594. He is the patron saint of those who are in danger of drowning. A visitor here to St. Hyacinth would be surprised that in just a few blocks there are so many Catholic churches. But if you look here in our church, we have a mural in the back depicting the 6 Poltown churches that are all in the area. In the early 1900s, there was an immediate need for another Polish parish in the area, with only 2 in existence at this time. The then bishop of the time, John Foley, accepted a petition from 31 members of this area to create a new parish. After 2 years of deliberation, Bishop Foley created the new St. Hyacinth Parish. It's a common thing that we hear at St. Hyacinth and how clean our church is. And we're very proud of that fact because we have many volunteers and parishioners who come and clean our church on a regular basis. We're also very proud of the way our beautiful Byzantine Romanesque church is designed. If you look at the main altar area, you will see a band of gold across the top with the medallions that represent all of the sacraments, with the Eucharist being the most prominent on the top. There are many statues that are prominent within the sanctuary. There are many statues of angels as well as cherub, which can be found above the tabernacle and on top of the high altar. But there's also statues of saints that grace the altar. One of the most amazing things that you notice in St. Hyacinth is these beautiful golden cupolas. Each cupola has representation for a certain group within the church. The first cupola is dedicated to the doctors of the church. The second of the Polish saints, with St. Hyacinth prominent in the middle. And lastly, the 4 major prophets of the Old Testament. The idea for a Tridentine Mass here at St. Hyacinth came up about 2 years ago. Some people thought it was maybe too far-fetched, but I didn't think so. First, I just interviewed some parishioners, and they were very open to the idea. Then I presented it to our pastor and to the parish council, and they agreed wholeheartedly in it. And our first Mass was in September of 2012, and since then we've had several Masses. The interesting part is how easy it was to organize, because we found a group who was able to provide us altar servers and even schedule a priest for us for these Masses. We also realized that people from other parishes, even local parishes here, were coming to celebrate Mass with us. So that gave us an idea. How about we just collaborate together? We came together at our parish. We talked about putting a Tridentine information newsletter together to talk about the basic information on the Tridentine Mass, who the celebrant was, and rosary time, confession, a little bit on the Catholic news, but mainly highlighting all the parishes within the Archdiocese of Detroit that were celebrating the Tridentine Mass. This really opened up the communication between parishes, especially here in the city with these traditional churches, these historic churches. It just broke down barriers that may have been set up years ago by maybe past generations. And it was so easy to do. And we took that idea with like an information flyer, and even our cluster parish, Queen of Apostles in Hamtramck, we set up a flyer that was in Polish, and we posted it within the local community and the local businesses to advertise. We worked with Juventude Michigan to have this Mass, which is a young adult group. Everything was about collaboration. It was collaborating with our sister parish, with parishes that aren't even affiliated with us, with Juventude Michigan. And it was all around the Tridentine Mass and around our Catholic tradition, which we all cherish.
Father Mark Borkowski is pastor of Our Lady of the Scapular Parish in Wyandotte, Michigan. Father Mark was the pastor of the first parish in the Archdiocese of Detroit to offer the Tridentine Mass. One of the most important supplies to have are priest's vestments. Father Mark brought a vestment set with him today. Could you explain what the components are?
This is a vestment that was, I guess you would call it, reclaimed. This is a vestment that's appropriate for Tridentine Mass, certainly, in the Roman style, and it's made from embroidered pieces that came from a vestment that once was in service, totally fell apart, and was rebuilt. So these things can be done. This is the chasuble, the outermost garment of the priest for celebration of Mass. Obviously it's red for Feast of Martyrs or the Holy Spirit.
That's known as a fiddleback vestment. Why is it called that?
Well, that's really not the formal name of it, but that's kind of a folksy name for this, because when you lay it out flat, it would look like a violin, a fiddle. So this is the outermost piece, the chasuble. What's going on underneath? You have the stole. Again, this stole is kind of made in the older Roman style. Interesting, when the priest in the Tridentine Rite wears a stole, it's crossed in front when he puts it on. This is the maniple. You don't see these in the modern times, although it's certainly permissible. It is a vestment that has origins in ancient Roman street clothes. It was worn over the arm of the priest when he's celebrating Mass. Interestingly enough, in the Tridentine Rite, the priest does take this off when he leaves the sanctuary to go to the pulpit and to read the readings in English and to preach the sermon. Then he returns to the sanctuary and puts the maniple back on. These pieces are for the chalice in the Tridentine Rite, and in Novus Ordo too. The chalice is veiled before it's used. So it's present in the sanctuary, covered in the veil. This is the burse. The burse is a pocket, and inside is kept the corporal. The corporal is that piece of linen that the priest says the Mass on, where the piece of cloth that the host and the chalice sit on. In the Tridentine Rite, the host, the very consecrated host, rests on the corporal. So it's a very sacred item. So it has to have its own place for protection and for dignity. Finally, this is the pall. It goes on top of the chalice to prevent anything getting into the wine after it's been consecrated and turned into the blood of Christ. It's not optional in the Tridentine Rite, and really it's a good idea for all celebrations of the sacred liturgy. It's nice if you can get all of these things, and it's nice if you can be in a church like this, but from my own experience, I will tell you, it can be done. The Tridentine Mass can be said beautifully and with dignity anywhere.
Imagine this challenge. Your diocese decides to close your parish. You and your fellow parishioners have deep faith that your church has architectural and cultural significance. You strike a deal to purchase the church from the diocese and get permission to continue holding masses in the church. But you have no assigned pastor, no financial guarantees. Oh, and it's not in the greatest neighborhood. These people took up that challenge here at Detroit's St. Albertus Church. Bob Duda and Celeste Grabowski are leaders of the Polish-American Historic Site Association, which now owns this incredible edifice. Who was St. Albertus?
St. Albertus, the patron saint of Poland. He was born in around 950 in Czechoslovakia. He became a bishop of Prague, and then he retired to become a monk. But the Polish king said, "We would like to have you come and convert the pagans north of Poland to bring peace to this particular area."
Celeste, take us to the current era. Tell us about the events that took place in 1989.
In 1989, the city of Detroit had changed a lot. So the Archdiocese at that time had to restructure a little bit, and they were closing a lot of the churches. And at that point, St. Albertus was one of the churches to be closed. So the parishioners went to the Archdiocese, and because of the strong history here, we are the first Polish Catholic church in the city of Detroit. They asked that we could stay open at least as a historic place, and then to also have masses. And the Archdiocese allowed us to do that and allowed the founding members to take over the church and the properties, the rectory and the school, and run that to keep it open as a historic site and also to have masses. But we were not allowed to have our own parish or parish priest. So the only masses we could have was if we had an outside priest that we could get to come in and say the masses.
Is there any precedent for this sort of arrangement having been made either here or in other dioceses?
I did hear that there was a church in New Orleans, St. Alphonsus, and in St. Louis, there's a shrine of St. Joseph, and here in the city of Detroit, St. Claude, that runs a Divine Mercy Chapel, that also takes over on their own outside of the Archdiocese.
Tell us about the architecture here. The outside of the church is kind of plain, but the inside is anything but.
That's done consciously. It wasn't because of a lack of money or a lack of ideas to make a very ornate church. It's because the church was made to reflect a point of view that life is not always happy. It's kind of maybe even dreary, and it's often very plain and mundane. These are the true aspects of life. But when you die, you go to heaven. Okay, heaven is a wonderful, splendid place. Well, they tried to do that in this church. As you look outside, it's plain. But you walk in here, it was meant to have you walking into heaven. And they did something else that not a lot of churches do. They combined styles. They combined a medieval style. And if you look at all the windows that have pictures on them, they're telling a story.
One of the latest windows that came into the church was the anniversary of Christianity in Poland, which was in 966. And it shows the baptism of the king at that time. The glory of God that people put this all together to come here and praise him in this building.
Something also unique here, they brought in an element of the Baroque, a very touchy-feely time in history. If you show the altar, you will see two statues in repose. Why did they put those bodies there? What is that telling us? It's very obvious. Everybody comes in here and looks at them, stares at them. But there's a very strong message, and that's the memento mori. I know that I'm going to die soon. That's reminding me that I better be good.
why is the sanctuary here so utterly massive?
Well, that's got to be because of the seminary and the Felician Sisters' house. They had these large ordinations and the times where they had all the ceremonies and things that came with all the different times of the Mass. So the church itself seats 2,500 people. The altar is huge because I think of all the ceremony and the people that were here. We had, I don't know how many priests at the rectory at the heyday. There was probably 6 or 7 priests living here and multiple masses all the time. So it was a different time than what we see now.
Vladimir Vakulik is an organist and music director for local Latin masses. The pipe organ at St. Albertus had not been playable for about 15 years when you stepped in and offered to fix it. How are you able to restore this instrument on such a restrictive budget?
You have to first assess what is the most important part in the organ that needs to be repaired in order to get the essential parts of the organ going. A lot of things that would have to be compromised, like certain parts would normally be thrown away, but we actually had to restore them and make them to work again.
Celeste, Bob, and Vladimir, what a vivid example of extraordinary faith you've put forth here at St. Albertus. Our next 4 episodes will take us to London, England, one of the most exuberantly Catholic cities in the world. In our first London episode, we'll visit Westminster Cathedral, where the parish administrator, himself a convert, and his assistant will give us background on this extraordinary house of worship. We'll join hundreds of London Catholics in the annual Rosary procession through the busy streets of the city. And we'll listen in on the renowned Westminster Cathedral Boys Choir, which sings at Mass every single day of the year. There's more information about every place and person we visit on our website, extraordinaryfaith.tv. Be sure to visit us there and like us on Facebook so you can be informed about our upcoming journeys. Thanks for partaking of our driver's eye view of the Motor City, and enjoy the beautiful scenery around Catholic tradition on our next episode of Extraordinary Faith.